and welcome to Gardener's World. What do you think? That is my unkept lawn. You might remember going back in the spring, I was putting primroses in just to give that extra bit of early colour. And then I was cutting it every 2-3 weeks, mower as high as it would go, keep taking the top off, and then about 6 weeks ago, I just let it go. And look at it. The clover, the achillea, all those sort of species grasses, the bees and other pollinators are really, really loving it. I come out that door in the morning and just there's a huge smile on your face. And it proves you don't need a huge area to add more diversity to your garden. Now, coming up on today's programme. Jo visits a garden designer who has transformed the walled garden that she used to play in as a child.
So what was it like here when you first arrived?
It hadn't been gardened for about 15 years or so. You couldn't get through the gate when I first came. It was brambles. The paths now, they were under probably 20 centimetres of soil.
We meet a gardener who has demonstrated what you can achieve with a little hard work.
I've always felt that you get out of gardens what you put into them. So the more work you can do to set the garden up correctly at the beginning, that will pay off in the end, and it absolutely has.
Arit goes to see a nurseryman bucking the trend in the world of houseplants.
I do really feel like I'm in houseplant heaven here. I'm looking across and I've just got a sea of green.
And I'll be trying to add diversity to even the smallest space. It's been a funny year, hasn't it? Rain, sun, more rain. The garden, flower-wise, has come and gone a lot this year. Things haven't lasted as long as I maybe would have wanted them to. You know, I'm putting the garden together slowly, you know, over the last couple of years. That structural planting has been really important. But the one plant that has jumped out at me is one that I already had here, which is this Acer. It shouldn't really be there, you know. I inherited it. But funny enough, that rich, dark purple just catches the eye, and that started to drive a thought process, and I want to introduce more of that across the garden. So I've got lovely elder across there, and that's why this is in. So this is Adriatina chocolate, grows to about 1.2 metres, will clump up, probably a couple of foot, so 600 mil, something like that. A white flower, which will ping a little bit, but for me it's that foliage. It connects straight away with that tree above me. So once that's in, that's my sort of base plant, and you can see it talks to the Agastache there, which is little adder. So then we're going to come in here, and this is a panicum, all right? So good grass, good flower later on in the year, plays with the light beautifully. But can you see in there, the dark tips? Again, straight away, he's talking to that. And this is called Cheyenne Sky. So if we get that one in, I think it's a bit deceiving because I'm under the tree here and you're thinking, why is he planting plants that like the sun, or even with that one, a little bit of semi-shade? This later on in the day absolutely bakes. So although at the moment it feels the sun comes in through here and then later on. So this wall gets really, really warm. So it's a little bit deceiving. So all the sun-loving plants do incredibly well in this border, so we break that up. And again, I know grasses are not everybody's cup of tea, but for me, they are proof that not everything in your garden needs to be a star, all right? Because, yeah, it plays with light, it gives the movement, but also it brings these other plants around it alive. Right, so this little tuberous allium, I can smell it already, that sort of oniony waft. And I've already seen the hoverflies on these. This is called Summer Beauty. give it away with a name, all right? There's flowers from now all the way through, probably well into September. But it's not just the flower that I'm enjoying, global sort of flower, which is lovely, but that vertical growth works really well with this euphorbia, Fens ruby. Well, that flowers earlier on in the year, but you've still got that wonderful fluffy foliage. And depending on the light it gets, that will darken down or it will lighten up. So there you go. Hoverflies are already enjoying that flower. I moved in here, what, 2.5 years ago. And I thought, here we go again. This is going to be a challenge. But Joe went to Derbyshire in June to meet a gardener that I think took on an awful lot more than I did.
As a young designer, it's really important that you have somewhere to garden so that you can understand how plants work together and how they perform. But it's not so easy to get your hands on a plot where you can do that. So when a neglected and unloved space came up, designer Amy Langren couldn't believe her luck.
Back in 2018, with very little garden space of her own, Amy hit on an idea to ask a family friend who owned an old overgrown walled garden if she could rescue it, and they kindly agreed.
6 years on, this is what Amy's created. So what was it like here when you first arrived?
It hadn't been gardened for about 15 years or so properly. And so you couldn't get through the gate when I first came. It was brambles. The paths now, they were under probably 20 centimetres of soil.
So it's like an archaeological...
An archaeological process.
So it sort of revealed itself?
Yeah. So I had an idea of the bones of the space, I suppose. I knew the garden as a child because my friend lives a few doors away, and so we used to have an adventure in here when we were younger. So bringing it back to a space that you could actually come into again was a really nice thing.
Did you have a plan of what you wanted to do with it?
I wanted a space to garden and to experiment in, to really see how plants work together and how they grow, and really make mistakes as well.
As a designer working on public and private spaces, Amy is inspired by naturalistic planting, where grasses and perennials mingle together. But she wanted to test out how resilient this style of planting would be in the challenging conditions here. Amy has limited time for maintenance, she has no water available on site, so she can't irrigate the garden, and working with little budget means she doesn't buy mulch. And with all that in mind, Amy created 2 different planting styles so she could compare their performances.
What are we standing in front of here?
Okay, so this is the first bit of the garden I planted, and this is what I call block planting. So all of the plants of the same species are all arranged in blocks. For example, this veronicastrum here, there's about 6 of those in that area, and then there's a separate block next to it of something different. What I'd always said about that is that it's easy to weed, because you can see that all of this is meant to be one type of plant. If there's a weed in there, you'll see it. That's the benefit, I suppose, of this planting. However, I found that it is actually very high maintenance.
Okay.
And so over time, this has been one of the most difficult bits of the garden to maintain, and it's where I spend the most of my time doing weeding.
That is really interesting. How come the weeds come into this area more than the others?
Some of it is down to issues I've made with maybe selecting plants that are maybe not very long-lived, and then they've disappeared and they've left a hole, which is then a problem for weeding, and it needs replanting with something else. Some plants, when you chop them down in kind of February time, some of them don't regrow their foliage till really late in the spring. So that's a kind of vulnerable time where you're going to get a lot of weeds potentially growing. So it's really important that this planting bed has a really good spring bulb layer that stops the weeds during that time of the year.
If you had to pick plants out of here that are seriously resilient that you would recommend, which would you go for?
Cirsium here is a brilliant one because it's really popular with the pollinators and
Yeah.
it flowers for such a long period. It's also got really good foliage. The leaves sit tight to the ground when it first grows, and so you don't get any weeds around it. This Sisyrinchium, it grows and then it seeds around the bed, and so it's starting to pop up, maybe not in blocks anymore.
You plant those together in blocks and you're going to have a pretty low maintenance, high impact, successful scheme.
Yeah.
And it's going to work.
Amy's experiment has shown which plants will do well in a block planting scheme. But what about the design of our other bed?
This is something quite different. This is the mixed planting bed. The plants in here, rather than being planted in clumps or blocks, they're completely intermingled with each other randomly. With this planting, you get a character across the whole bed, and also I found this to be very low maintenance.
Really?
I
Okay.
do almost no weeding in this bed.
That is
I
so
think-
interesting. I would have thought this would be higher maintenance than the border over there. How are these plants performing to make that happen?
So there's a series of different layers to it.
Yeah.
So the first layer, and probably the most important layer, is ground covers. So we've got things that are basically suppressing the weeds and covering the soil.
Yeah, I can see heucheras in there,
Yeah, so we've
the
got...
purple heuchera.
Yeah, we've got tiarellas as well. So anything that has nice large leaves. So the second layer of the planting is the seasonal interest. So at the moment, the things that are flowering are these beautiful pink astrantias.
Yeah, lovely.
The euphorbias still look great. They look great
Yeah.
all the time,
Yeah.
to be honest, because they're evergreen, but they look really limey and colourful at this time of year. We've got the nepetas here that the bees love.
And then the fireworks of the alliums sort of popping through, adding plenty of height.
So a few self-seeders is the final layer of the planting, and they'd only be a very small amount, maybe 5%. And what they do is if you end up with a patch of bare soil, they seed into it and they take the place of that plant.
What percentage of ground cover have you got under there?
Around 50%.
To think that once it's established, it's the lowest maintenance part of this garden. I think it's brilliant.
While most of us gardeners like to find a corner to hide our compost in, Amy's found an ingenious way to put it centre stage and create a wonderful wildlife habitat too.
I think this is the most beautiful dead hedge I've ever seen. Now, a dead hedge is simply that. It's all the twigs and stems and clippings from perennials all piled on top of each other. And here Amy has just whacked some posts into the ground, woven some twigs through it to hold it all together. And then every year, those what we call arisings from a garden end up stacked on top. And that's one way of keeping all the organic matter in a garden together. But I think it looks great, and obviously it functions well too. What would you say to the young girl, yourself, who was running around this walled garden, climbing the walls and climbing the trees? I mean, you know, would you have ever imagined that you'd be here gardening it?
No, I don't think I would have imagined. And, you know, there is something quite childlike about gardening, I think. Like, you are digging in the dirt and you are experimenting. And, yeah, I feel being here, it is rooted to my childhood. And I do still get that pleasure of experimentation and fun while I'm here.
Come on then, let's go. Come on. There you go, little man. Good boy. You coming? That sense of satisfaction that Amy must have from creating that space from where it was. But I also agree that idea of experimenting and finding what works well for you and your garden. Brilliant. Come on, little man, let's go. as a lot of you know, I do love the project. So this is more, I suppose, of a revamp. This was a log store we had at the old house. So what I want to do is I want to put that cedar matting on top of here. So it creates a lovely green roof and another habitat. But when you think about it, this could be, all right, for me it's a log store, it could be a bin store. If you look over there behind me, I've got cedar matting on top of my office roof. But what you've got to remember, the bigger your green roof gets, the more support it's going to need. So good, strong box, not going to go anywhere. First thing you would put in here would be a pond liner. So what you want to do is make sure that the whole of your box is nice and waterproof. Yeah? That's nicely pressed into the corners. Put that up there. This has got a very slight slope on it. Not steep, you don't want the water hitting it and then running off, but you don't want the water just sitting there all the time. I haven't allowed for extra drainage in this. If you were doing a big area, you would find that through that pond liner, like I have on my office over there, you maybe have a pipe and you'd have an overflow, just in case that it really did start to fill with water. Here, this is small, so I don't have to worry about it. Now, next up, this is what we call a drainage layer, and you would buy this. So this fleecy bit at the bottom, that protects your liner. Then next up, let's describe it as sort of plastic, upside down egg box. And then on top of that, you know your capillary matting that you have in your greenhouses a lot, got a layer of that on top, and that's like a filter. And then we're going to work that protective fleece in first. If you buy it as a whole, it would come stuck to it, which means you wouldn't be fiddling about like I am. Now what you can do is start to fill up with the aggregate. So, what this is topsoil and lightweight aggregate. I have seen it done with old broken bits of hardcore, you know, and brick. A little bit of board. Give that one little work over. So that will settle down. Now, that, as simple as it seems, is ready for the turf. This was all left over from another job that I was doing. Fold it back over and let's go. I did wet this before I started. You don't have to, but I just feel sometimes when they're really dry, this sedum just feels a little bit brittle. And it gives an opportunity. Look, you can see that coconut fibre, that creates the mat, and then peat free, and then this was obviously seeded into that. So what we're going to do now is put that right up to the edges. It really is that simple. And what I'm going to do with this liner and this fleece, I'm going to give this time just to settle down first, and then probably a week or so's time I will come round and just tidy everything up. So there you go, first one down. Let's get this next bit. There we go. So, another bit goes down. Don't want those overlapping. So just work those in so that joint's nice and tight. What's that taking me? Not long at all. All I'm going to do now is give that a good watering in. But that will be incredible. It'll be alive. It's a new world. And then it comes into flower, and then the pollinators come in. And it changes colour. It goes to a deep red as we get to the back end of the summer. So if you've got a sunny little spot where you put a bin store, a log store, I don't think this is a bad idea. Do you? Now, we're off to meet a gardener who has worked wonders with the sloping site, and I would say is definitely not scared of hard work.
The sense of solace and the sanctuary that the garden gives us is probably the best thing about it. the fact that it does bring the pressure down. Whenever we come out here, it just helps us stop, which is a big deal. I'm Ben Story. This is my garden in southwest London, which I designed myself and is effectively 14 years worth of ideas crammed into one space. My partner Brandon and I bought this flat in 2016. The driving factor of buying this place was the garden that we got. It's not large by UK standards, but by London standards, it's big. It's really big. The design came about through necessity more than anything else. We were on a slope, so to use that space well, we decided to terrace it. So we had some nice flat areas to stand on. From that was born how we get the shapes, the structure, and then it's kind of evolved from there, really. When we moved in, I was out here doing the garden, levelling off the terraces by hand because we were on a really tight budget in the beginning. I've always felt that you get out of gardens what you put into them. So the more work you can do to set the garden up correctly at the beginning, that will pay off in the end, and it absolutely has. So the garden is about 8.5 metres wide and 21 metres long. It's divided down into several tiers. We start in the courtyard, which is actually about 2 metres below ground level because we're in a basement flat. So the planting down here was chosen predominantly for its green textural leaf shape, but also the things like the bamboo. The black stems tie in with the windows and the furniture that we have down here. So typically the stems are covered by foliage, but because we wanted to see that colour really clearly against the yellow brick wall, we stripped the stems down so that it exposes that nice dark rich black bamboo cane. So there's a bit of an aesthetic architectural element to it, but also practically speaking, this was a real echo chamber when it was first completed. And the foliage and bamboo helps disperse that noise and makes it much quieter, which is way more neighbour friendly when we're having dinner out here. I grew up on a farm in Durham, northeast of England. My dad was the farmer, my mum was the gardener, and part of the style of planting comes very much from that. Particularly from the hedgerows, the sporadic nature of plants. Birds will drop seeds in the hedge and there'll be a random plant that pops up that has nothing to do with anything else around it. That's been a big influence in how I've planted the garden. This is the main level of the garden. Lots of grasses, lots of very simple formed flowers. Not really worrying about the colour palette, but thinking more about what is the closest form to the natural form that I can find, but it's still a cultivated plant, so it's quite robust and it's been through the mill a bit. Part of that is finding plants that self-seed to give that naturalised effect, things like the verbena Bampton. So in addition to those self-seeders, we have these random pops of colour, and in the hedgerow context, that is plants that have grown from seeds that birds have dropped, and that's things like the Crocosmia or the Lychnis or the anemones that give these little bits of extra interest, there's extra layers of colour. And all of that together gives me this nostalgic memory of being in the northeast on my parents' farm, but also just give a real contrast to the courtyard in that this is a much more flower-driven level, it's more about colour, and it feels a bit more energetic up here. So there are about 14 trees in this garden. They are predominantly productive trees, so they're all fruit. And they have really influenced the types of plants we can grow in the garden because as they've grown, it's made the garden naturally more shaded. So it's changed it from being much more meadowy and slightly frothy kind of planting to quite a bit more subdued shade-loving plants. This is the sunken seating area, and it became part of the design of the garden to try and change the perspective of the garden a little bit so you can view it from a different angle, and because we're lower and down on planting level, it actually makes you feel much more part of the garden. And for me, it actually invokes memories of being in the big grass fields at home, the hay fields, when the grass comes up really tall. And as a kid, you can hunker down in it and really be part of the landscape. So the best time of day to be here in this position is first thing in the morning when the sun is just filtering through the trees above. And the dappled light gives a really nice calm effect and a really nice way to start the day. Even with the best horticultural knowledge in the world, nobody can tell you how to garden in your space because your microclimate is different to everybody else's, and plants will react differently to that climate. So things in this garden have evolved really naturally. I knew where I wanted to place the main elements, like the trees, which obviously you can't really move, but everything else is a movable feast.
One of my favorite parts about the garden is the fact that we live in one of the biggest cities in the entire world. We're surrounded by brick and concrete, and yet you come back here and you have this rich and diverse ecosystem that's living in our back garden. The plants just keep changing, the planting changes, and I really enjoy being in the space and just getting to take a deep breath.
The garden itself, just having a space that we can come out into and decompress is a big deal. But also being able to share that, so we opened through the National Garden Scheme, and sharing that and giving our message and making sure that people understand that it's possible to have this even in Zone 2 London.
I think, like so many others, it's absolutely lovely that Ben and Brandon opened their garden for the National Garden Scheme. And if you want more information about that, go to our website. I, for one, know how much work it is to create those series of terraces from a sloped garden. The graft that's been put in was amazing. But I did also enjoy the tiny little spaces where they could go and just have a moment, which is very much what the idea was here. Think about it, this is the back end of the garden, so it's the top. What do you want, young lady? Eh? What is it with Labradors? Eh? The moment you stop stroking them, they're straight away at you again. So this is the back end of the garden. You might remember back in the spring I was planting it. I'm really pleased, genuinely. Those trees that I lifted the canopies, so you've still got these wonderful glances back through, but you feel quite wrapped and tucked away from the house. Look behind me, hydrangea quercifolia is absolutely singing at the moment and proves that colour white just pops in a shady spot. So this year it was about getting their roots in, getting them settled, and then I started to add some of the herbaceous planting. So there's ferns in there, there's geraniums, and then there's little oddities. And I think the rest of it I'm going to do September, October time. And although it's not finished, already getting the sense that it's going to provide exactly what I wanted, which is just an area where you could just have a moment. Maybe even listen to the birds sing. Is that not what gardens are about? Actually, Ida, that's not a bad idea. It's a warm day. Thirsty girl. Now it's time for one of your films, and we're off to East Lothian.
Hi everyone, I'm Rachel White and I'm from North Berwick in Scotland. And today I'm going to show you the transformation of my front lawn into 2 flourishing flower beds. I wanted to attract more pollinators to my garden, as well as create a space that was going to be nice to relax in. So a little over a year ago, this area here was completely covered in grass. To begin the project, I carefully mapped out the layout, marked the ground and began digging things out. And everyone got involved, so both my daughters, Rebecca and Anna, and my husband all helped to dig it out. We installed wooden frames to outline the path and flower beds, and then turned over the soil, enriched it with improver, and then set out planning where to plant everything. And of course, selecting those pollinator-friendly plants. And this is the result, which we're absolutely delighted with. And it's not just us who are delighted with it. The bees, as you can see here, are also pretty pleased. So I've tried not to let the bad weather get in the way of me getting into the garden, which is just as well because we've had a lot of bad weather this year so far. I also wanted to demonstrate how you can fill a garden very cheaply. And all in, I've probably spent about £100 on filling the flower beds here. And I've done that through planting things from seeds. I've had gifts and exchange plants with family and friends. I've bought a few bits and pieces, and some of the plants here have actually self-seeded as well. Hopefully this has been helpful and inspired some of you to get out in your gardens in all weathers to create a space that can be enjoyed by you and our pollinators.
Rachel, your front garden looks absolutely incredible. And what I love about that is so many more people are going to see it, unlike the back garden, which is our private space. And you're going to inspire people. People are going to walk past and want to have a go. Hedge cutting. It's that time of year. If you are going out, though, make sure that there's no birds nesting. If you're anything like me, the growth on the hedges this year, look at that. This hornbeam, I think, is put on nearly 2 foot. The early wet conditions has really helped the hedges, my trees as well. It feels like everything is in a much better place than it was last year. So there is some positive to that rain. Then when you think about adding a hedge, look locally. You know, see what's growing. Have you got beeches really good? Have you got hornbeams local? Is crataegus? Whatever it is, see what's growing well around you. And that will be a good choice for a hedge. I mean, they're incredible habitats. So as I said, you know, you check that there's no birds. And then really, it's all about just squaring them up. That main growth has now been put on. So we best crack on. Still to come on today's programme. Arit visits a nursery going against the grain in the houseplant world.
Where did it all begin?
So this all began from our family cut flower farm where we grow things like dahlias and tulips, and sadly in doing so we generate a little bit of waste. So we decided to take that negative and turn it into a positive and use all that waste we generate to form a lovely compost and growing media to grow all these beautiful types of houseplant.
And we meet a gardener who is never happier than when she's growing her own veg.
The garden is just like a great big playground. It allows me to just constantly change and tweak and experiment. And that is an awful lot of fun.
So, if you saw Francis and myself at the Tatton Flower Show a few weeks ago, you might well recognise this plant. I was walking around the marquee and I came across that. It's Coniogram emiensis, but known actually as a bamboo fern. And I couldn't resist it, I'll be honest. I'm going to grow it in a container for 2 reasons. One is, it's very susceptible to slugs, but also when it comes to temperature, it looks like it'll take to about -5, -6. So I'm not sure how well it's going to get on through the winter. So by containerising it, it gives me the option, if it starts to get really cold, and this is semi-evergreen, so if it starts to sort of retreat, what I'm going to do is I can pop it in the greenhouse, or maybe I can wrap it in some fleece. If you were watching earlier on in the year, you might remember that piece of nylon as well. It was suggested to me that if you put that in the bottom there, it will stop the slugs coming up through. Well, I think it works, and I'm going to prove it to you later on. Next thing is the croc's going to go in. So when it comes to compost mix, I've got peat-free compost. I made my own mix. I've got topsoil in there, some composted bark, and some grit. So why have I done that? If you start sort of studying and understanding where this comes from, it comes from China, and on a mountainside, loves sort of damp shade. So this mix that I've got, really in my head, is as close to those natural conditions as I can. So this plant will grow to roughly about 2 foot. So you're talking sort of 60 centimetres. Lovely rooting system. So we work that in. That actual foliage is natural. So imagine being in China, you know, at the bottom of a mountain, and coming across this growing in the wild. I mean, it's sort of reasonably new to the market. You know, it's not been about for years. I think it's a little beauty. So give us a couple of taps. Right, that there a bit. Another thing that seems to do me well is just topping things off with a little grit. This is quite sharp, horticultural grit, but not only do I think that helps a little bit with the slugs, but I think it looks nice. So there you go. I think that is a proper Bobby Dazzler. I'm going to move that into a shady spot and give it a drop of water. But while I do that, we're going to catch up with Arit.
I'm a huge fan of houseplants, and I'm not the only one, as their popularity is growing year on year. But what is concerning is that the majority of indoor plants are grown in peat and imported from around the world, and that has a huge environmental impact. But I've come to Gebban Green in Hertfordshire, where Will Clayton is producing a huge range of houseplants and embracing every aspect of growing planet-friendly plants. Will, I do really feel like I'm in houseplant heaven here. I'm looking across and I've just got a sea of green. What sort of things are you growing here?
So we grow tropical house plants. So we grow everything from calatheas to these lovely fatsia, syngonium, alocasia, monstera, ferns, ficuses, you name it.
You've got them here. I mean, it looks wonderful, smells wonderful. Where did it all begin?
So this all began from our family cut flower farm, where we grow things like dahlias and tulips, oriental lilies, and sadly, in doing so, we generate a little bit of waste through the growing media, the bulbs, the leaves, the roots, the stems. So we decided to take that negative and turn it into a positive and use all that waste we generate to form a lovely compost and growing media to grow all these beautiful types of houseplant.
The family business now produces 100% of the compost needed for their houseplants.
So this mix you see here is totally peat-free, and it has been generated by taking all of the waste products, shredding it together, and then heating it to about 90 degrees, using only steam, for about an hour. And that creates this beautiful compost ready to go. We recycle it time and time again, and then for houseplants, we just add a little bit of perlite to help plants root when they're small, to aerate that mix.
So that's really, really great, and of course, because you're sterilising, you can keep reusing it. But there is the plug, though, isn't there? There is still the plugs that have to be bought in, and they do still contain elements of peat.
So there are very few plug suppliers, so it's done on a huge scale. And at the minute, all of those large-scale producers are based on the continent, where the pressures to go peat-free are much less than they are in the UK. So they don't have quite that same incentive or urgency that we've got in Britain to get rid of our peat. So although they are moving more peat-free, and every year the percentage of peat comes down a little bit, it is a little slower than we'd like.
Growing houseplants more sustainably doesn't just come down to the compost. To produce them also requires large amounts of fossil carbon energy in the form of heat and light. And here too, Will is trying to lead the way.
So what we do is make sure that we use the most environmentally friendly inputs that we possibly can. So when we do need to heat our glasshouse, we use biomass. When we do need to use light, we use LEDs. And when we need to use water, we make sure we collect it from the roof or use our own spring-fed reservoir rather than the mains.
While Will is doing his bit as a grower, there's so much we can do as consumers to reduce the environmental impact of houseplant production. And perhaps the biggest thing we can do is reduce waste by ensuring the plants we buy thrive and don't end up being thrown away in the compost bin themselves. What can we do to kind of make sure that we're not wasting indoor plants?
Well, I think the first thing to do is make sure you get the right plants in the right place. So identify what your environment is, and then have a little bit of a look as to what type of species would fit that particular environment. And then be aware that some plants require a little more care, slightly greener fingers than others. So a great beginner plant, for instance, is this chlorophytum, often known as a spider plant. It's really, really tough. It can take most forms of light. If you overwater it, underwater it, it'll tell you and you can bring it back to life again, and it grows really, really quickly. Whereas something like Calathea really don't like change at all. They like to find their place and sit there. So a lot of people move their houseplants around, trying to find a new look. That is when a Calathea is going to get in big trouble.
Oh.
It can deal with a bit more shade than most plants, so it doesn't need that much light, but it really wants stable conditions and warmth.
Okay, because when I had my first Calathea, it all curled up and went brown around the outside, and then the leaves dropped a little bit, and then I was watering like mad.
Most people will kill their plants through kindness rather than neglect. Constant watering is bad for a houseplant. In terms of when to water, I would never water to a schedule. I would always recommend watering with the finger test. So shove your finger in the pot, and if you can feel any moisture, it doesn't need any more.
I think the other thing as well in terms of care is, when do I repot? What do you advise on that?
Give it a good squeeze. Some plants will be fine in their own pot for a really long period of time. Others will need potting up a bit more often if they grow faster. So if you give the pot a good squeeze and it's got some give in it, it's totally fine. If it's really firm and there's no give in it, you need to put it in a bigger pot.
I guess it's really key, isn't it, in the spirit of what you're doing in terms of kind of making sure that we can get sustainability and longevity out of our plants. If we just do a little bit of homework and research how to look after them, we can really get the most out of these plants.
You really can, and that helps from the sustainability point, but we also want people to love their plants and enjoy them, and that's going to happen if you've got beautiful plants that are growing well.
I thought that was really fascinating, and you got the sense that commercially it really was quite pioneering. Think back, I'm 21 years old. I know, it was a while ago. I got a job for a man called Jeff Hamilton, who used to present Gardener's World. I walked in there. This man was peat-free. He was organic. He was already questioning what we were doing to our countryside. You know, a man completely ahead of his time. And I think for me, he set a moral compass as to how I should garden, and I've pretty much been following it ever since. Jeff was definitely full of wonderful tips and ideas, and I think he would have liked that mesh idea. So you put it in the bottom of the pot and the slugs can't get up through the pot. Well, look at my hostas. There doesn't look like there's any slug or snail damage. Every single one of these has got nylon in. There's one around the corner that hasn't. It's been absolutely mullered. So I am going to keep on putting nylon in the bottom. Gardeners are always sharing tips and ideas. Some work, some don't. One that I was told about this particular fern that is susceptible to the slugs is to put some liquid seaweed in. Soak that foliage, and apparently that will help keep them at bay. But time will tell. But that's what it's all about. It's about experimenting and understanding your little space. You know, around there we're in the heat. Come round here, straight away it's a few degrees cooler. Understanding those microclimates and then planting the spaces to suit their particular climates, you really can create something special. On that note, last August, we went to see Liz Zorab, who I think, as a gardener, has nailed that idea of really understanding the space.
I want a garden that looks as beautiful as it is productive. So I want to come out here and go, yes, every time I come out, and for the flowers to sing and to shine, and almost for the vegetables to be incidental. But then when you actually start looking, actually the vegetables are also the stars of the show. We're on a north-facing hillside in Carmarthenshire. about 200 metres above sea level, and the site is about 4.5 acres, and then I actually garden and use a productive area of about 1 acre. And what I guess you could call a lazy gardener. I will very happily let nature just self-sow seeds. I will let plants scramble through other plants, and I'm not too fussed about tidying up all the time. I don't need and I don't want straight rows of plants, which makes it all very easy just for nature to do her own thing. In this corner, I've got a collection of, there's Cavolo Nero kale and sweet corn, agastache. There's some monarda, which I use for potpourri, and then thyme, which I use in cooking. I think that growing so many flowers in amongst the vegetables has an enormous impact in terms of bringing pollinators in. This bed is mostly perennials. This is a Welsh onion, so it's a bunching onion. And one of the things I really like about the Welsh onions is they produce really pretty flower heads, which then go to seed. And I let the seeds drop and let them grow, and then I've got more of them for next year and years beyond. I harvest by just picking the leaves, and then I chop them, and they're quite strong. They're strong enough for me. And I also chop them and freeze them, so I've got them for use right through the winter as well. Back in 2015, I was working in the community sector in a full-time job, and I started getting more and more ill to the point where I gave up work. I made the decision, and I suggested to my husband, Mr. J, that I stayed at home and grew our food as my financial contribution to the household. I think one of the biggest benefits to gardening in this way has been to be able to eat fresh food, eat food that's in season. So I'm constantly looking for alternatives to almost any veg, so that I've got something to fall back on if one crop fails, but also so I've got variety, because if you're eating from your garden and you've only got a limited number of veg, actually your diet can get quite boring. So I'm constantly looking for things that will be an alternative to the norm. This is a lovely bed. I'm really pleased with this one. So I've got a lot of rhubarb, which I use in vegetable dishes like curries, but I also use it to make rhubarb wine, which makes a really nice clear white wine. And then a yacon, which is one of the largest tubers that you can grow in the UK. And it has a slightly appley, slightly pear taste, but I'm growing it as an alternative to potatoes.
The wine that Liz makes it's a knockout. I actually can't drink it when I'm working the next day because we don't actually know how strong it is. But it's great. The produce that we get out of here is fantastic. And there's all sorts of things that we didn't know we liked. You know, growing up, things like beetroot and so forth are just meh. But beetroot out of here is fantastic, and it's such a versatile vegetable. Yeah. It's eye-opening, I think, is probably the best way to describe it.
This is my rose arch, and until the roses have grown up and over it, I'm growing these Greek gigantes beans, and I love these because they're buttery and creamy, and I use them as an alternative to potatoes, and in fact they taste just like creamy mashed potatoes. In this bed is a dwarf Jerusalem artichoke. So normally they get really tall and can be quite invasive, but this is a dwarf variety that only gets to this sort of height, around 60 centimetres, and is much slower in spreading. And I like it because it provides some lovely yellow flowers towards the end of the season when there isn't necessarily as many colourful vegetables around. It's one of those vegetables that people either really like or they don't, and we really like them. The garden is just like a great big playground. It allows me to just constantly change and tweak and experiment to get it right. And I'm never going to get it right because nature does a thing. And that is an awful lot of fun. It's so satisfying to be able to live this life and to live with the land the way we do.
Yeah. Very, very proud of you.
Thank you.
Oh, soppy old sausage.
You coming? Liz, I totally agree with the interplanting your edibles and your ornamentals. I've now committed the rest of this garden to exactly that, but also that idea of experimenting. And on that note, that's the next job. I have worked in a load of well-rotted manure into this little space, which I'm now treading. That's a good starting place. See that? That's what you call third time lucky. What I mean by that is over the last 2 years, every brassica I've put in this garden has been mullered by either cabbage whites or pigeons. This year, because it's the last chance, guess what? It rains a lot, the butterflies don't arrive. For some reason, we've got not so many pigeons. The kales are looking absolutely brilliant. So I'm going to add some more. Look at the leaf on that. It's beautiful. It's a kale, and it's called Red Russian. Let's just take these out. So it's an old variety. Actually, as it matures going into the winter, purple veining really deepens. What's nice about this variety is the younger leaves are really good for salads. And Mrs. Frost does love a kale salad. But the later, the more mature leaves, they will work really well as we go into winter. And look, I know it seems strange, doesn't it? But you do not want that plant rocking around. So I'm going to put them a little bit closer than I would normally if I was putting them in rows. And you'll see that I'm planting them slightly deeper. Work that back round. There we go. Another couple, I reckon. All I've got to do now is give those a good watering in and then protect them with that netting and that steel work, which will keep the cabbage whites and hopefully the pigeons at bay. So these will be great for later on in the year, but you might have noticed this veg garden is rocking and rolling and there's loads to pick for tea. So this is a purple French bean. They're quite good because you can actually see them flowers and you can track the beans down. These youngsters are great for the top of a salad. Hey, can you see that smile? That's a happy boy. Look at this. Seriously, if you'd have seen my kale the last 2 years, you'd have just laughed at me. One more. This is the magic of veg growing. You might remember I sowed these bloody beans back in April, and look at them now. It's like Jack and a beanstalk. They're redding up, so I could pick them, but I just let them dry on the plant, and they will be great for a winter stew. So this is me being a little chefy. These are Siberian chives. Look great, but the punch in one of those flowers is incredible. I'm starting to feel a little peckish now, but best till last. Look at that, eh? That smells amazing. That's dessert sorted. While I go in and do something creative with this basket of beauties, here's a few jobs you could be doing at the weekend. I often leave self-seeders to do their own thing, but sometimes I like to collect the seed myself and sow at a later date. Choose a dry sunny day and look for seed heads that are completely ripe, like these poppy capsules. Empty into a paper bag or an envelope and remember to label it before storing somewhere cool and dry. There's still time to get some leeks in the ground, and while it's too late to sow any yourself, there's a good chance you'll be able to buy some. All you need is a tray of young plants about the thickness of a pencil. Gently tease them apart before trimming off some of the roots. Using a dibber, make a series of holes about 15 centimetres deep, leaving a gap of about 20 centimetres between each one. Drop a leek into each hole and resist the temptation to backfill with soil. Give them a good drink, and if it stays dry, water them every couple of days until they get established. Climbing roses like my Shropshire lass have put on a lot of growth this season, and in an attempt to get it under control, I'm tying it in. This will help prevent it from sprawling all over the border, as well as stop any whippy shoots from being damaged by the wind. Loosely tie in each shoot to its support. This is just a temporary measure. Come the winter, when the birds have enjoyed the hips, I'll give it a good prune and train some of the branches to the horizontal. Come on then, let's go. Hey? It's a lovely day, Isla, wasn't it? Hey? Was, girl? It was. There we go. Dinner for one. Well, one man and his dog. I'm afraid that is about it from us this week, but Monty will be back next week, 8 p.m. at Longmeadow. Do you want to say bye-bye? No, she doesn't want to say goodbye. She wants to share my salad. Bye-bye. Look after yourselves. You won't like this.